Guys, welcome back to another episode of the podcast. This is a really exciting episode, I think, for everyone watching. Thank you again. If you are watching, make sure you guys hit that like button, comment, and subscribe. Today, the topic is going to be centered around trauma. I feel like as a population, we are under constant stress of how we take on things that we live day to day. So maybe today we can give you a little bit of insight on how to tackle that and where would be a possible resource that you can look for a solution, because hey, at the end of the day, we all want to live happy, we all want to live fulfilled. So let's just hop right into it. Sostenes Lima from Somatic Therapy, how are you?
I'm doing well today. Yeah, I'm doing really good. Yeah.
How does your routine normally look for today?
Oh, in the morning. So today, right? So usually I start off with a little bit because I'm working on a writing project. So I start off with writing in the morning. I'm seeing a lot of my clients because I'm on the East Coast at this time. So a lot of clients the afternoon later on. So I'm seeing all my clients online. So I'm a therapist, right? So I see a lot of my clients online in the afternoon and early evenings. So that's what my routine looks like today.
And tell me a little bit about your background. Like where were you born? Where are you from? How does it come to where you become a therapist?
That's a very interesting question. A very, maybe a lengthy answer. So I guess hold on for it.
Yeah.
So I was born in Brazil, right? Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. From what people would call like a favela, like one of the biggest favela in Rio de Janeiro, right? When I was 8 years old, my parents immigrated to the U.S., right? So during that time, and even in Brazil, without me knowing, I think I started getting the experience of like therapy. My dad was a minister, right? So he was like in church. So a lot of folks constantly over my house, right? For whatever reason, sharing their difficult situations, right? So they'll have like, which I write a little bit about, like the kitchen table experience, right? People come and sit at the kitchen table and they will talk about whatever's going on, right? And my parents took in a lot of folks, right? In Brazil, and even when we moved here to the US, right? So I think for a huge part of it, me in the background, just like observing people, right? People with needs, different situations, right? Where my parents would kind of sit down with them and help them kind of figure out their life, right? And I think that to an extent was sort of my first exposure to like a certain type of therapy, right? And then my parents moved here to the US when I was like 8 years old, right? And we moved to like Miami, Florida, and we lived all around like South Florida area. And being one, like, again, my dad being a minister, right? We had a lot of folks who eventually like moved from Brazil to the U.S. So they will always sort of make this stop over our house, right? And I know a lot of folks from like Latin America will have this experience that people will move, right, from their home country, and they're like for a month or a week or two until they get settled in, they kind of like live with you, right?
Yeah.
So we sort of had that experience, right? Where folks will come in and people have different ways that they can get to the U.S. So you hear all this like stories, right? And again, me being in the backgrounds, me and my siblings, I have 3 other brothers, right? So we used to hear all of these stories, right? When you're young, you kind of just hear it and just kind of it's like part of like your normal life.
Did you feel like it impacted you in any shape or form, as in like becoming more empathetic or kind of being more considerate?
Yes, I wouldn't be able to tell you that as a kid though, right?
Really?
As a child, I was like sort of my normal life, right? Me reflecting back in it, of course, right? I got to, I'm really good at I don't want to say reading people, right? I'm really good at like meeting people and kind of understanding people really quickly, right? It's because I've seen so many people with so many different issues, with so many different like backgrounds, right? And I encountered that a lot ever since a very young age, right? And I have empathy for folks, right? And that I heard his experiences. At the time, I probably wasn't like emotionally moved by it as I am probably now, which is a very interesting thing, right? I thought it was, it's just normal. People kind of go through the situations, right? Whatever it might be, right? A woman dealing with domestic violence at home, right? That she will kind of seek out the pastors of the church and like, hey, this is happening. This is like, okay, you can stay with us for a couple of weeks until whatever we figure this out, right? And like I would hear these stories, right? And next day I had to go to school, right?
Yeah.
And like it's a normal life, right? It goes into this whole experience also of this what we call like secondary trauma, right? That you start hearing this trauma from a very young age to hear some of this very difficult situations, right?
Yeah.
But you're just kind of, again, getting up, going to school, and kind of dealing with the normal school stuff, but you have this sort of thing that you're kind of taking in, this information, right? And also heavy emotional information, right?
So is that secondary trauma something bad at an early age to hear so much of it? Or is it also revealing to be a good part of it?
It's both, right? I think it depends, right? I think like people have different ways of like raising their kids, right?
Yeah.
You don't want to expose kids to too much traumatic stuff, right? Right. I'm all for helping kids kind of get through difficult times, right? So if a kid's on the monkey bar and falls down, right, you want to kind of help them, like, hey, get back on the monkey bar, right?
Okay.
And that kind of teaches them resilience, right? I think that's really good, healthy resilience, right? It's very different than hearing like domestic violence, right?
Yeah. I think the impact is completely different. And sometimes, I mean, I know that child development goes on various levels. So, I mean, if your brain and you're not thinking right, you just kind of like maybe associate that with certain things. So, I mean, like it's a different experience you have as a kid, and I feel like it goes based off the kid. So, I didn't know whether that was good or bad or not.
Yeah, so I will say it was very useful for me now.
Okay.
I think it probably affected me, right, a certain way, right, and to kind of go even to like so a personal effect, right. I also, like, we immigrated to the U.S., so like I had to deal with like undocumented status, right. So like all of that like my parents had to deal with, like a really huge part of my life, right, even into my early adult years, right. So something I had to like deal with. So there is even like, I'll argue, a trauma around even that, right. The awareness of like, this could be like, you can be like moved at any certain time, right? Family members who were deported and all of that kind of stuff that we encountered, right? And people that were close to you, right? It's a form of a loss, right? It's what we call a lot of the time in the therapy world, like psychological loss, right? They might be still alive, but you don't see them anymore, right?
Yeah.
There's a psychological loss there, right? You're like, they're alive, right? And the same thing kind of goes with folks who have people who like struggle with substance use, right? They're like a couple of years ago, they were here with me and this and this. I know they're out there running the streets, whatever they're doing, right? And they're struggling with this substance use, right? But I don't see them. Haven't heard from them for years and this and that, right? So the part of you feel like you actually lost someone, right?
And for like, whenever kids are suffering through that, because I have suffered, or I feel like a lot of immigrants have suffered through that undocumented phase on like, what's my future? Like, will my parents be here tomorrow?
Yeah.
Is there any way to counteract those type of thoughts, like in that instant, whether through positive thinking or is there anything to do?
So so the part of it, right? A lot of kids with that, who's dealing with that, they actually don't verbalize it a lot. They don't talk about it, right? They're like, some will, right? Some kids are able to kind of say like, hey, this happened, right? My dad, right? This like was deported, whatever it might be the situation, right? So a lot of kids actually repress all of those feelings, right? Some of it is because sometimes in their home, they were not taught to like express feeling and process feeling, some of that stuff, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of times it comes out in behaviors, right? And like the kid's getting in trouble in school, right? Or the kid can focus in school, right? I'll share a little bit of story, right? I had a kid years ago, right? And he had a lot of behavior issues, right? It's a handful of behavior issues at school. I worked at a school in New York City, but this has nothing to do with that. But a lot of behavior issues, right? And couldn't sit still in class, right? So like, had all this diagnosis and this can sit still, this and that, right? But when you actually start sitting down with the child, like, oh, like you just lost your mom, right? Your mom just got deported, all this type of stuff. Like, and this is like what's on the forefront of his mind if you actually dig deep enough, right? How do you expect a teenage kid to kind of focus, right? Learn algebra, right? Yeah. When there's so much grief and pain that's happening, right? Most people, if a huge loss like that happens while they're at work, they will become dysregulated at work, right? Now you're expecting the kid to kind of go and focus and sit in a classroom for 6 hours and not move, right? Your body will have this sort of inability to sit still, because it kind of goes into this place of like of what we call mobilization, like this fight or flight, right? We could talk more about that. They're like, oh, I can't, something huge is happening. I can't just sit here. I need to like help, right? So it becomes very like energetic, right? So there's a lot of things that's kind of happening, right? So a lot of the times is actually like validating that emotion, right? That child comes in, it's like, oh, you're not actually crazy. You're not this, and this. Like, you have a huge pain, right? That even like me, I couldn't imagine going through it, right? Yeah. I'm not showing up to work for like, I'm taking months or whatever it is. I have that experience, right? So like, again, to expect that child, but even validating that experience for a lot of folks, right? It settles them. Like, okay, I'm not like weird. I'm not crazy. I'm not off, right? There's something that's happening in me that I never verbalize, right? So once they're able to say that out there, and right, and the person kind of matches them and say like, hey, and accept them, they're like, oh, okay. And their body begins to settle, right? And then from there, you start able to make better choices and some of that, right? There are a lot of like reframing skills, right? Where it's also helpful, right? So would be like a person that, right, thinking that like, everything bad's gonna happen, right? Because like, hey, I just lost my mom and this, like everything's kind of going down the drain, right? I can't trust anyone, I can't trust this. So like, okay, like let's be here now, right? Let's think about the things that's here. You do have some folks that are around you, right? That are helpful in this and kind of helping them kind of reframe it, right? A bit, right? Because again, our mind, I don't see it as like a negative thought per se. It kind of goes into just like survival mode, like something really, really bad happened. Let's be careful, right? Because it goes back to like our very like this survivor part of us that kind of lived in those thousands and thousands of years ago when we all were sort of like indigenous and lived in the jungle and this and that, right? When you sort of like walked through a situation where like a tiger will attack your village, right? So you had to kind of be on alert, right? Like this and that. Like tiger might come back again tomorrow, right? So we kind of are constantly on alert, right? The thing is, a lot of folks will have a very traumatic experience, right? And they stay on alert, right? And the alert part is not needed, right? When they're like grocery shopping or they're doing like random things throughout the day, that their body doesn't need to be in this sort of like survival state, right? The flight or flight state. No, that was a long answer.
No, and that's a good one though, because just like you were saying that maybe the habits that we build up is because of that survival mode. So therefore, that's why there's no defined situation on how people are going to behave. Because again, survival mode today, it's a lot different world where we're grocery shopping. So you're not afraid that you picking up your food, you're gonna be attacked by something. Yeah. So I can see how that plays out. And what type of therapies exist or do you capture in at your firm?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I'm what will be called like an integrative therapist.
Integrative, okay.
Right. So some people call it eclectic therapy, right? That I use like multiple modalities, right? To kind of help the person, the client out, right? And kind of see what kind of fits them.
Are those traditional ways of therapy, or is therapy evolving, and that's why those are coming up?
So that's a good question, right? When it comes to like therapeutic models and some of this stuff, I'm actually a huge nerd.
Okay.
Right. So like, let's talk about like my style, right? So I have a very traditional base, right? So what you will see from like a Freudian background, some of that's like the famous folks, right? Like Freud and psychoanalysis. So what I was kind of trained in that modality, right? So I was sort of like my training. I worked in New York. That was sort of like my training, right? So I do a lot of my framing, right? Of like, okay, how this early like experiences during your childhood impact you now, right? So go ahead.
And let me ask you, but Freud, like I've always Sigmund Freud, right? If I'm saying it right, what type of therapy did he explore, or like did he explore the mind?
Yeah, so so like the therapy explorer, right? He talked a lot about the psyche, but a lot of like his whole idea, right, came from the idea of like, okay, like there's this experiences during your childhood, right?
Okay.
And how does it impact you now, like relationally, right? And a lot of like the first experiences that we have relationally are with our parents, right? So like this the first time that we ever feel like any kind of emotions or feelings, right? Our initial experience with any emotions or feelings are usually at home with our parents, right? The first time we get upset, mad, sad, all of those feelings, right? And how do like our parents respond to those experiences? And we start like making sense of that, right? You're like, oh, okay, like I used to get really mad when I was little, and my parents would ignore me, right? When I got really mad, just like, oh, just leave him alone. Just like he'll stop crying eventually, right?
Yeah.
So there's like that response, right? And then you see that during adulthood, right? That like, oh, no one cares about me when I have these feelings and this and that, right? And it starts coming out during your adult age, right? Like you see in relationships, right? Like a partner would get like all these feelings, right? Or right, it comes out in the way of like, okay, like I feel this feeling, I don't share it with no one, right? I kind of keep it to myself, right? And because you were taught like no one's going to respond to that feeling. So a huge part of your life is specifically to a lot of times with men, not all men, but like a lot of men have that experience, right? Like, like I'm not going to give you attention if you're crying. A 5-year-old boy, a 6-year-old boy, right? They kind of like, and they kind of like ignore and this. So like man starts like, or you dad or mom get really upset at you for having an emotional experience, right? Like, hey, you don't get to get upset, you don't get to be sad, you don't get to have these emotions, right? Like, stop it, whatever it might be, right? And there's times and different things, right? But they start learning like, oh, this is not accepted in my world right now, right? You have this really small world, and you start thinking, oh, this feeling is not accepted, right? And it's the survival things to kind of begin to ignore and repress that feeling, right?
So Freud kind of explains that on how that develops.
100%.
So how do you build off that, and how does the therapy that you're doing?
Yeah, so like a lot of folks sometimes come to me to kind of like make sense of their like relationships or whatever they're going through, right? And they're like, I don't know, I keep coming in and out of relationships. I wonder why this is happening, right? And you start exploring their history around it, right? Some of it's like they have a lot of like trust issues, right? That comes from like a really, really early age that like they can't trust anyone. Like a parent left the home, right? So like they like, I don't know, like I feel this feeling this person always gonna leave, right? I can't trust them, right? And it's all sort of connected to that experience, right? So once you start processing that, those early experiences, they are kind of like in a way set in your mind, right? You start processing, you're like, oh, okay, this makes sense. You start developing some like compassion for that younger self. Slowly you start changing because you start going to the root of it, right? You start understanding, and during those times where you feel like this person's gonna leave me, that thought comes like, oh, this is like my childhood part coming up, right? That younger part of me that's coming up, that's afraid that this is gonna happen, right? That my partner's gonna leave me, right? That my partner's out there doing this and this and this and this and that, right?
Are a lot of us doing that subconsciously without us knowing?
100%, right? I think it's most of the time it's what we're doing, right? And I think what therapy does, it kind of puts that little like pause in your mind, like, oh, okay, I know where this comes from, right? This response, right? Where before it was very like an unconscious response, very much impulsive response, right? And now you're able to kind of slow down, right? There's sort of this like stoplight, right? Like before you kind of just go through the light, now you're like, oh, there's a light here. Well, let me think about this. Okay, I'm having this response, right? Does that make a little bit of sense?
No, yeah, and it's so intriguing to me how you're saying that therapy makes you aware, but at the same time, it's in the back of your brain. But until your persona actually becomes aware, you're able to have the ability to counteract it.
100%. Yeah.
And it's like two people living in like in one body.
100%, right? There is this, and you use the word persona, that's a very like psychology word, right?
Oh, really? Okay.
From Carl Jung, right? Which it is like the part that like most people like see, right? This is like the persona, right? The part that gets dressed up and this, right? Where there's like what we call like different complexes, right? We have different parts, right? when you were a child, you might act a certain way. Like you might like talk like with a different tone, right? When you're with an elder, you might talk a different way. When you're with your friends, you might talk a different way, right? People see different parts of you, and that's normal, right? We all do it, right? It's all like survival parts of us, right?
Oh, that's the survival part of it too,
100%, right? And every human has like these, I will argue, have like these different parts, right? You see a part of me now, I'm seeing a part of you now, right? And then there's like this other part where I think it's become a very like normal word that we use, like the shadow parts of us that no one gets to see, that we sort of know a bit also. Sometimes we don't even know it fully as the shadow parts are, and it comes out in different ways. Yeah. And we're like, keep that part down, right?
And those are like the darker parts, you would say, right? Because like even Sigmund Freud talks about it. Carl Jung is also one of them.
Carl Jung, yeah.
Carl Jung is the one who talks about it.
Yeah, so he's the one that kind of uses the word complexes, right? I use the word a lot like parts. There's different parts of you, and that's where like a lot of like how like therapy has evolved. We use like different languages, right? Because a lot of those old literature, right, it's just hard to read, hard to make sense of, right? So we use a lot of words like part, right? Like, oh, there's a part of you that always does this. There's a part of you for some reason goes crazy when this happens, right? And like, okay, what is this part of you? Why is it showing up now? What it wants, and this and this and this. So you start reflecting on that part of you, right? Like, where does it come from? How long it's been around, right? And then you start being aware of that part of you, right? And that's when you start to get to work with it, right? And and a huge part of it, like you can't change nothing you don't know, right? Like I can't tell a person, hey, go do this. Go change your life right now if I don't know nothing about them, right? I have to get to know them. I have to like build this relationship, this emotional relationship. And then maybe I can influence a little bit more, right? Yeah. And same thing kind of go with parts of ourselves, right? So a lot of folks have like anger issues, right? And they're like, I don't know why every time I have this anger part, but I'm not an angry person. I just don't know what it is, right? Yeah. You start to get to know that anger part of them, right? And their history of that anger. And when did it first shows up, right? Was it because of a trauma happened at a really young age? So there's this anger part that shows up to protect them, right? So anytime they feel attacked or this part shows up like, hey, this is not going to happen again, right? So like that part, so processing that part, right? You actually had to get to know that part to get to the trauma, right? You can't just kind of push through that part to get to the trauma, right? So that afraid little boy who experienced something very, very like traumatic, right?
And how hard is it to get down to the process part of it? Because just like I could try to bring out something out of an individual, it's up to the individual to bring it up in the conversation before I do. So I would essentially have to say I'd have to have a process, or a therapist have a process to breaking it down. Because Carl Rogers, have you ever?
Carl Rogers.
He's a great. Like I saw him break. I think it was like a thug or something like that he interviewed it. But he was explaining how the power of conversation, or whenever you start showing empathy to the person, it brings out certain things out of the individual. But not everyone can do that. Do therapists know how to do that?
Yeah, I think so I will make a huge argument that like that's what actually heals therapy, right? That's like the whole like thing with therapy, right? There's a lot of theories, a lot of modalities, and some people like different modalities and this and that. But that relationship is what like heal people, right? And I think that's huge, right? And for people to build trust, right? You don't want to kind of just throw people in the fire, like, oh, that happened to you when you were 10 years old. Tell me about that time, right? The person's gonna like shut down emotionally, right? Or they're gonna become really numb. They might be able to tell you the story, but they're very numb, and nothing is happening when that's happening, right? But to build that relationship and trust, right? It's huge, right? And then people feel more safe to process something that was very unsafe, right? Very traumatic, very hard, right? Now they're sharing an experience that was unsafe in a safe environment, right? Now they have a voice where they didn't have a voice before, right? A lot of times we were children, right? There's always a power dynamic. It's really hard for kids to speak up about things, and even some do speak up and they are ignored or whatever it might be, right? Yeah. So to have that experience now where like, oh, like we're sort of like going back to this place, but now I have some safety in place, and now I have a voice, right? So your brain starts taking this into consideration, right? And this is what like the healing kind of happens over time, right? Where again, there's this experience where the child has usually is with a person who harms them, right? And so they're going through the experience where they like don't trust people, whatever it might be. But now they're sharing this experience, and instead of having a person who harms you, you have a person who actually accepts and is there for you, right? You're like, oh, okay, like, okay, now this feels a little bit different, right? Your body's like, okay, I'm telling this story again, but now I'm actually being accepted, right? And that's what, over time, your body kind of gets used to that experience, right? Because you're telling that story over and over again. The clinical word for that is like corrective experience, right? So like every time when you were a child, when you got sad or upset, your parents got upset with you, right? But now in therapy, every time you kind of tell the story of like, oh, this week I got really upset at my boss, right? He wrote me this email and it was like, whatever it was, right? I'm really, really upset. And I'm like, okay. And I kind of help you kind of process that emotion, right? Instead of like, no, you shouldn't be upset, man. Like, that's his position. That's his this and this, right? Instead of having the same response like your parents had, right? I'm having a different response where you're like, oh, I feel accepted. I feel known. Of course, they're not like thinking about this. It's not like a cognitive thing that's happening in their brain, but this is also like, it's a process, right? It's happening in our brain, right? Our brain are actually very flexible, right? It's a very flexible thing that over time we tend to like change, right?
Would you say that the individuals that have the most trauma are the most difficult to process, or for them to process their traumas? Does it take time to even get something out of it? Because
That's a good question, right? I think a lot of the times, a lot of folks have like what we call like complex PTSD or complex trauma, right? It's this ongoing experiences of trauma. They a lot of times have a really hard time trusting folks, right? Even if they're not aware that they don't have time. So like to like actually process a lot of that times, they will have these back to the parts that will show up, right? You're having therapy with them, they might get really sleepy. Like, I don't know, man, I always get sleepy, right? Because a part of them is like checking out, right? A part of them is like, oh, I can't be, this is really heavy, really painful, I'm gonna check out, right? My body taught me to check out when things get really heavy, really painful, right? So like that kind of happens, right? So over time, they begin to like build that trust, right? And this is what the Carl Rogers part of it, like empathy, right? When you start showing people empathy, showing up for them in different ways, and just being present with them is huge, right? And connecting them through language, right? There's this whole part of even like re-emphasizing what they're saying, right? And Carl Rogers was huge on that, right? Like, really? Oh, that made me really upset. Like, oh, that made you upset, right? And this is the whole thing, like, oh, this person kind of gets me, even though they're not like cognitively thinking it.
You know, well, that's actually like asking questions. Like whenever you're learning, it's like if you're asking questions, it means you're getting it, and so like that reassurance is kind of like, oh, you're actually getting what I'm saying.
100%, right? And I think that's develops, and this person like slowly humans, right? There's a part of us that wants to connect, right? Wants to have a relationship, this desire, right? Even the folks who are I'll argue like most like troubled, right? That you have these very like strong diagnoses. I don't like to throw this language out as much, right? Like narcissism, right? There's a lot of folks who might struggle with that, right? I know now in society, everyone throws out that word, right? I have a sort of this part of me, I don't like to throw it out as much because everyone has girlfriend or boyfriend who's a narcissist, right? And that's fine. People are trying to identify what's happening for them, right? But a person who has like narcissism, a lot of times they have like a huge like lack of empathy, right? They also have a lot of pain. They have a huge amount of pain that they show up with this part, right? That's very much, I'm good at this and this. I don't listen to anyone. I'm just like so focused on survival, right? There's a reason they're like that, right? There's usually a huge reason why they're like that. There's a lot of pain that's underneath all of that.
Oh, so that doesn't stem from you just thinking you're
usually
everything.
Usually not, right? A lot of those like personality disorder usually comes from huge traumatic experiences, right? Again, like something big happened, right, in your childhood, and something that you said, I can't trust the world around me. It's not safe. How do I protect myself, right? So the survival part, right? And it becomes very, for some people, more elevated than others, right? So they're like in this, and sometimes there's some like genetic stuff that kind of goes into that as well, right? That play a role into that. But usually there's this experiences during childhood, right? That make people kind of have this very like part of them looks a certain way, right? It's a very exaggerated part, right? Because all of us have this narcissist part of us, right? It's actually there's like healthy narcissism, like this part of us that our self and confidence, right? We all need it to like survive in this world and this and that, right? Then there's like the clinical part of folks who are, right, who are very troubled, right? And that's a whole different thing. But all of us have this part of us that's like, we kind of need like this, I believe in myself. I need to do this, I need to do that. I'm looking out for myself, right? At this moment, we all sort of have that part of us, right?
Yeah.
Their part is just more exaggerated, right? It's more like it's more expanded in them, right? But a lot of the time, it also comes from like huge traumatic events, right? That they're like, I'm not gonna let anyone hurt me anymore. I'm not gonna let something like attack me in the same way anymore. They're not thinking of this like cognitively, right? But they create a whole personality around this part, right?
Yeah.
And it's their survival mechanism, right?
Do you think narcissism is more prevalent now, or is that word being? Because I hear that word being thrown around so much in these days. Is it because of what social media has done on impact on people?
I think I kind of. So there's this really good thing that's happening now of like mental health is so more broad, right? There's a lot more folks getting like therapy and some of that, doing their own trauma work and some of that stuff, and that's huge, right?
But I don't know. I would argue that whenever you are making it so readily available, and now there's so many resources, I think there's an adequate type of therapy for everyone. No, too, right?
Yeah, I think I've been in therapy, right? I think I'll argue every therapist need to go to therapy, do their own work before they become a therapist, right? And also it's an ongoing process, right? So there's different times, different things that you might need, different type of like experiences with your therapist, right? You're looking for different things during that time, right? So I definitely agree with you, right? Some folks that need to like maybe work on just stabilizing their life is just, they're so dysregulated. There's so much happening that they can't even like process what's happening, right? So they kind of need somebody to sit with them, help them take deep breaths, kind of help them kind of like, okay, I become really agitated when I'm around people and this and this, and just kind of like calming their body, right? So there's different skills that you can use around that, right? Where some folks, they're a bit more reflective, right? They can just sit and process, right? And start connecting the dots. Oh, this is why I was like this. This is why I have this experience, right? This is what happened to me in my childhood. And they're able to like verbally kind of express some of that, right? So in different stages, you might have different experiences, right? It's really hard to get somebody who's like in survival mode, who might be dealing with homelessness and like anxiety, all of this stuff, right? And you tell them like, hey, tell me about that time, your early experiences of pain. They're like, what do you mean, man? Like, I'm struggling with like getting housing right now, right? This is painful right now, right? Even though there's might be some like historical context to that, right? They can't go there. And it's also not healthy to go there, right? Like you're probably gonna dysregulate them even more, right? You're just kind of tossing them into the fire, right? So to also be able to know like, okay, let's be here for now until you're in a better place that you can reflect some of that, right? And this is the idea of some exposure type of like therapy, right? You don't want to rush anybody into this very like difficult times that were unsafe, right? If you don't have that safety in place with a client, that rapport in place with a client, you do not want to go to a place where they feel unsafe, right? Now they feel unsafe again in the room with you, right? They feel like, so they think their body think it's happening all over again, right? So they might start shaking, they might start having these experiences, right? So like that starts happening, right? So building that rapport is huge, right? Because over time, they're like, once they start getting to that, close to that trauma, or even close to that trauma, they know there's a safety that's happening in the room, right? And so to kind of push them there, it'll be just, could be re-traumatizing a lot of the time. So
wow.
Yeah.
And do you face a lot of skepticism whenever you first meet a client? What does it take for a person to like kind of consider like, hey, I could possibly need therapy? Because I mean, there's just the way that therapy is prevalent, I think a lot of people are still stopping themselves from actually putting themselves there. Because I'll take my experience. Like the first time I ever got therapy, I was like, what am I gonna do with a stranger? I am gonna sit in front of him and he's gonna ask me questions like an interrogation. Like me getting myself through there was such a big process that I can only imagine people that take things differently than I do.
100%, right? I think I will argue that everyone will have that skepticism in them, right, to an extent, right? There's reasons for it. A lot of folks are just not used to kind of sitting with someone and talking about their feelings and emotions, right? They never had an experience where they sat with someone and like, hey, I feel this and this and this and this and that, right? It's a very like odd experience for them, right? And so like there's a hard time around that. And that's why the relationship part is like huge, right? There's this huge part like building a relationship with them, right? And there's different reasons why people go to therapy, right? And why they find themselves in the therapist room, right? A person might be in prison, right? And they're like, oh, like if you want to reduce your time here, go see the therapist, right? And they're like I don't know what to talk to this person about, right?
Yeah.
Like, is it really confidential or not, right? And it's very confidential, right? Therapists cannot like share what happens in that space, right? But they don't feel safe, right? They are not in a safe environment, right? And also people were taught their whole life to not like process and share feelings, right? Directly or indirectly, they were taught like, hey, you don't get to like talk about your feelings, right? So a lot of times, of course, this idea of like therapy seems like foreign to them, right?
Yeah.
The way that I kind of explain to folks, right? Therapy and like it has been to an extent professionalized, right? But it comes from a different traditions, right?
Professionalized, okay.
Yeah, so like it's a whole profession, and this we go to school for it, right? But the idea, it comes from like different tradition, right? So like a lot of folks don't know this, right? So the person who Freud studied under, right? Joseph Brewer, right? And he was like this guy who, well, he was a doctor, right? That he started seeing a lot of people coming to him with all of these different issues, but will work with them like, well, you don't really have this issue, you just have this random pain in your body, right? And you kind of help them like talk it through. He was like, oh, he started saying the talking cure, right? The talking cure, right? And they were Jewish, right? So this folks in Vienna, right? This in Europe that time, the Jewish population was seen as like a second grade citizens, right? They were hated, right? During that time, the late 1800s, right? They were not accepted, right? In that community, right? So he took a tradition that's like very based on Judaism, right? Of like confession and sharing your feelings and some of this and stuff that it's also in some like other spiritual traditions like Christianity, like confession and some of this stuff that we kind of have, right? So it comes from that, but it's also even built into like indigenous cultures, right? That also sort of did this thing, right? Of like processing what's happening for them, right? They did it through different modes, different ways of like, this is really like painful, right? We lost this child, right? And we're doing this ceremony to process what's happening, what happened to this loss that we had in our community, right? So we always had different like process loss, traumas in different ways, right? So it's embedded, a part of us is embedded in us, right? Mm-hmm. But throughout the years, for whatever reasons, right, we had to kind of like make up this part of us to survive, right? And I'm gonna use the example around men, right? Men especially from a lot of like Latin American culture, right? And also folks with like history of like from Africa, right? They have this part of us, right? That we learn from their very early age, right? And like traditions of it, like you can't appear like soft, you can't appear this and this, right? And like you're talking about like indigenous folks who are being attacked, mm-hmm. right? Yeah. So like what is the point of like, hey man, like I got attacked yesterday, man, this and this, and like processing that will also like show this weakness part of you, right? It's not needed it was not needed, right? If you're being attacked by the Spaniards, in my case, the Portuguese, right? Yeah. And like you're having all this experience, there's no time to kind of sit down and process feelings and emotions of this huge trauma that's happening, right? So your body kind of go into survival mode, right? And then you teach your kids that and then that kind of is passed on generation of like men who are built a certain way, right? We're not being attacked by, right? The whatever, Spain and Portuguese, right? And I kind of have all these parts in me, like I'm like 30% Portuguese, 30% indigenous, 30% African, right? So I have this Brazilian amalgamation of all these like different cultures that experienced a lot, right? And so like all of these men who kind of experienced these experiences, like I can't show feelings or emotions, right? When that happens, I'm attacked, right? If I appear like weak or any kind of thing, like my life is on the line, so I can't. So that's passed on, right?
And let me ask you, since we're talking about the concept of war, we're talking about, because war in some ways is like trauma too for the people that are living in it, and as well as how we talked, you said Carl Jung, right? Study after. How does that basis differ from the philosophy of like the Romans? Like, you know how they, like you were saying, like, okay, if you know you're gonna go to war, you go through it, and you don't have enough time to process it. But then there's also like Stoic philosophy, and it's like you have to remain calm. You have to not let your environment affect you. How is that? Is therapy something that evolved over here in the Western world?
Go ahead. Sorry.
And how does it differ from like philosophy then?
No, I think there's a part of it that's very similar to philosophy. A lot of folks who do psychotherapy, right? There's an interest in philosophy, and there's a lot of like arguments around like therapy in general. Like the nerd part of me, like, oh, when does a person actually start acknowledging that they are humans, right? Is it when they're like fresh out of birth, right? Or they're 2 years old, 3, 4, 5 years old? There's like all this like stuff that like philosophers been arguing even before like therapists were around, right? So there's this parts of it, right? There's this philosophy around it. The difference between like philosophy and psychotherapy, right, is that therapy, right, there's a healing component around it, right? There's a focus that's it's open-ended for some therapists, right? But a lot of the time there's this focus of like healing that's happening, right? That majority of people who go into therapy, there's some type of desire or need for it, right? Most people are not waking up and saying like, yeah, I'm just going to therapy. I'm just going to find out what that's about. Even if they say that, there's something in them that's driving them, because they know therapy is like, it's like for like exploring these parts of you, right? Or painful parts of you, right? So they know, like, even if they just want to try it out, right? There's something there that's drawing them to that, right? What also, like, socially, there's this experiences socially, right? So humans are constantly like we're in survival mode, but we're constantly looking for safety, right? We're constantly looking for like this sort of safety, right? When socially there's not a lot of safety, right? Not a lot of safety nets, right, happening. Parts of us start showing up with like anxiety, different things, right? Economy is like housing everywhere in the U.S. is really high right now, right?
Yeah.
Interest rates are really high, right? So all these things, people start like having anxiety. Shelter is a huge part of safety, right? So they start having these experiences, right? But if that's in place, right, your body's a bit more settled, right?
Okay.
So so that's like the difference, I will say, with, right, even if you have a history of like survival, right? But there's social parts of you like are feeling safe. Like, okay, like my grandparents, parents, all this stuff, they had this huge survival part of them. But now that's part of me is like met, right, in different ways. And it's usually like met, I'll say like 90%. Sometimes it comes out in relationship, right? Like, again, like the trust stuff, right?
Yeah.
But even though like socially it might be accepted, right? There's some things that come up and then anxiety, right? But so kind of having that safety for people, it settles them, right? It settles them, right? And that calm, right? It's really hard to be able to feel calm when there's like all this stuff happening around you.
And just as you and I are both immigrants, it's like you've had clients, I think, from a diverse background, right? What do you think because of how our parents were culturally brought up, is there any way to like ever change that? Because I feel like a lot of my friends that I've talked to, even as the years have passed, their parents haven't changed. And that affects us culturally so much, because culturally too, we are always, or me personally, I'm always seeking approval of my parents.
Yeah.
As a Hispanic, I can say that. I'm constantly seeking their approval. And I really didn't get it when I was young. and I still haven't been able to change them until now. And for them, it's so hard to even consider therapy. Is there a possible solution how to bring it up to them?
I think there's this, of course, as we age, these personalities that we have, it kind of become a little bit more concrete over time, right? If you're a certain way for decades of your life, right, that part of you becomes a little bit more concrete. Still malleable, right? I will argue that it's still malleable. People still work with it, right? And it's all about like building relationships, right? Again, like if they meet a therapist has to like know that like, okay, this person for their whole life, they had this part of them for survival reasons, right? For me to try to take this part away, it's really unhealthy because they don't know how to live without this, right? So a lot of times like, oh, I understand why you act that way. I understand like that empathy part of them, that part of you that's kind of texting. And then slowly they kind of start relaxing, right? And they started putting that guard down, right? Everyone has the ability to put their guard down. And people will do it different ways, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's like through comedy, sometimes through this, like, oh, like, I ain't never seen that laugh like that before, right? Or whatever it is, right? Like, so the guard goes down. There's something that happens that the guard goes down, right? And to be able to eventually tap into that, and then they're able to process things, right? And there's like also like beliefs, right? Beliefs are and sometimes some beliefs are attached, like religious belief, cultural beliefs, and all this thing that's embedded in folks, right? For whatever reason, it's embedded in them, right? So it's kind of telling a person like, hey, like, I'm not sure about like beating your kids, right? And you're having this conversation with them, right? And they're like, no, my dad beat me and I turned out pretty fine. And they'll have this conversation, right? And again, like to kind of say like, as a therapist, to kind of say like, hey, don't do that, right? Of course, there's like laws around that I have to kind of follow, right? But like, there's this part of like, if you kind of go indirectly and say like, hey, do not beat your kids, this and this, this and this and this and this, the person's shutting down, right? They're like this and this and that, right? And the same thing goes for like an elder, right, who walks in your space and say like, hey, you did all of this wrong. Even if they feel that this like did things wrong when they were parenting, they're gonna shut down. Like, I don't know you. Who are you trying to tell me that I did this wrong, right? That I raised my kids wrong, right? So like all of these things, right? So a part of it is slowly building that rapport, right? There is this part of that you're agreeing a lot, right? But you can agree without actually bringing in your own views on that, right? You can say, oh, and you're agreeing with the feeling, right? With the idea of it, right? And the understanding, like, oh, I understand what led you to kind of like do all of this, right? Because you know, like history of kids acting up, right? Lead them to maybe get involved in criminal behaviors and this and this and this. So you try to really cut that down, right? So there's this history of that, right? That a lot of folks are called, they're like, no, like if I don't correct them now, the police is going to correct them, right?
Yeah.
So like there's this whole idea around, so like that understanding, right? It's huge. And right. And this is where the cultural awareness and sensitivity kind of comes in, right? And to be able to know, okay, there's a reason why this person is like, had this response, right? There's a reason why they're acting the way that they're acting right now. There's this part of them that for whatever reason is acting this way, right? And to kind of push that down and ignore it, that person's gonna shut down. They're gonna close up, right? But there's ways to connect, right? There's always this ability to connect, and once people start feeling like you understand them, and you're like, oh, this person understands me, they start sharing more, open more, and then from there they start like evaluating those things. Like, okay, that was really hard, right? Of course, I didn't like when my parents beat me, right? And some of that stuff. And okay, this makes a lot of sense, right? Okay, there's this part of me, this survival part of me that's still in me, right? Still might need it, right? If something really bad happens, right? I need like save my child, whatever it is. I need the survival part to show up. I need all this energy and this very over masculine part to show up, right? Because I need it. Like it's needed in some spaces, right? So to be able to know when you need it and when you don't need it, right? You don't need it when you're watching a TV show, right?
Yeah.
You don't need it when you're grocery shopping and you're looking at grapes, right? What's the point of you having all of this energy, survival energy, right? This war mentality when you're like looking at grapes at the grocery store. Yeah.
So the best thing as parents as we can do is just try to be like, talk to the children, right?
Yeah. Be present in talking, right? So there's this experiences around, like, kids are gonna have their experiences around emotions when they're young. Again, like every kid will show their range of emotions during their childhood, right? They'll get sad, upset, and this is like human, right? We're gonna have these experiences when we're young. Our parents, the way they respond to that is very like, we start understanding the world around us. Like, oh, I'm not allowed to do this. I'm allowed to do this, right? I'm allowed to be angry when something bad happens, right? But I'm not allowed to be sad, right? So like sadness kind of goes to the background,
wow, okay.
right? So like, because this is all your response from your parents. Even if you act over and over and over again, right? You start getting this sort of like response of like, that's not allowed in my house, right? And so like that idea is little by little starts getting repressed, right? So there's ways to respond to kids, right? Kids are gonna get upset. Kids are gonna have, again, they're gonna have all of these emotions, right? A part of it is like acknowledging their emotion and then helping them kind of like respond to the emotions, right? Like, oh, like, of course that made you upset that your brother broke your toy, right? That's normal that you're gonna be upset. Okay, like, doesn't mean you need to like go and hit them, right?
Yeah.
So kind of have that conversation around them, like, hey, like, we're not gonna hit each other in this house, right? And that slowly but little, it kind of starts building this idea in them, like, okay, like, it's okay that I feel angry, right? If I lose something breaks, or all this, it's a normal emotion. Anger is actually a normal emotion to have. It's an emotion, right? It's okay if I feel sad, right? That I was playing with my doll and like the head came off, right? And I feel really sad because it was my Barbie doll, right? And this and this and that, right? Instead of like, when that happens, mom or dad, like, hey, like, we don't get to cry. Like, we don't get to cry over that, right? This and that. Like, there's a lot of other tough things going on, right? Oh, this and this and that. I lost my job last week, so you don't get to cry because I didn't cry when that happened, so you don't get to cry, right? And you're like, oh, okay, right? And you're 4, 5, 6-year-old kind of taking this information, like, oh, I don't get to like cry, I don't get to have emotions, right? And when show up, get like, oh, of course, this is your world, right? Of course, that Barbie head gets like taken off. Like, of course, it's gonna make you sad, right? How can we respond to that now? I'm really sorry that made you sad. Like, that feeling is valid. Like, and then how do we respond to it, right? And then that person they're able also to like express their emotion properly when they get older. They're also able to handle emotions, right?
Yeah.
And then if something really bad happens when they're an adult, right, and they have this huge loss, right? And it's like, oh, like, I know sadness. I can like get through sadness, right? Where some people they never were allowed to feel sad. So something huge happens, they're like, I hate being sad. Why I'm feeling sad? Why is this happening? Stop, sadness, stops. I don't get to feel that sad. I gotta go to work and this because they were taught, right, that they don't get to have this emotion, right? So they don't know how to respond to it. So the emotion is impulsively coming out, right? And they're at work, and it's normal that sometimes we start crying with everything, right? And the emotion comes out and you're like, oh shit, I was not expecting this emotion today, right? Because you don't know how to handle it because you've been taught years and years to kind of push it down, right?
And let me ask you, since the response of the parents is so important, but now in today's age, I think like a lot of us are growing up in single parent homes. How much is it affecting us down the line to whether we're missing one parent or the other, have neither? And sometimes there's situations where there is no response, even there is a parent there. Like, there's no love from the dad or stepmom's there, but never really cares for me. How much does it really affect us down the line?
It depends on the person, right? I think it depends on the person. There is always this part of us, right, that I would say if the parent was not around for whatever reason, right, that we feel this emotional abandonment, right? Some of it's physical abandonment, emotional abandonment, and abandonment can express itself in many different ways, right? So a lot of folks carry that, right? That like, and like sometimes like they have a feeling of emptiness that they're constantly carrying with them, right? And there's a part of like, I can't trust people around me. I can't this and that, right? And to kind of use the language that you used earlier around just like gaining approval from like a parent, right? Or other people, right? So there's this part of us that wants to approve, wants to keep people around, right? Because we know from a very early age, right? We had this experience where somebody like left, right? So we're like, oh, we want people to stay around. We don't want to have that experience again where people like leave us, right? So we want to keep people around, right? For whatever reason now, if the parent is around now, right? When people like regain relationship with their parents, right? They're like, oh, I gotta make sure that mom, dad like likes me, right? They're not cognitively thinking this, right? But they're constantly in this space of like trying to get approval, trying to get this experience, right? And it's like, oh, okay, it comes from this place where like you don't want to have that experience of like being abandoned again, right? Physically or emotionally, right? Some folks, their parent like overworked, right? They kind of get to this country, right? Their parents work a lot, mom and dad work, right? And you get home from school, you're by yourself, right? And so you're having this experience where you're kind of like raising yourself, right?
Yeah.
Alone. And so this is all sort of happening, right? So when you become an adult, right, you have this extreme responses, right? Of like, when they have a partner, they're like, I don't want you to leave. I don't want you to do this. It's just because they're scared of that happening again. Or they're like, you're going to leave, like, forget you and this, right? Like, I know this story. So they're going to have like one of these responses, right?
It could be either or.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
And usually these things also are in the spectrum, right? It's right. So like people have different responses, but these are like on the extreme side of it, right? And it comes out, right? And it's like yeah, like no one's ever around, right? But that comes from a very early age of experiences that no one was around.
Yeah.
Right. No one's here to like see me do my like kind of help me kind of get through my experiences or whatever it might be. So that's what sometimes what brings people to therapy, right? The surface experience that they're happening now, like, man, like I don't care about people, man. They this and this and this and that is happening, right? And it's like, oh, like no one cared about you when you were young, right? And it's sort of like, and to kind of help them eventually get back there, process those emotions, right? And then slowly they start building healthy relationships around them, right? And also like there's a hypervigilance that kind of comes with that, right? Of like, I can't trust people, right? Which like your body has like all of this energy when they're like around people, right? They're like, I can't trust this and this and this. So you're constantly aware, right? So all this energy is happening in your body, right? So like your blood pressure goes up, all of these things that a lot of folks with a lot of trauma have issues with, right? So there's like this physical response, right? That you're constantly on guard, you're tight, right? And your body starts having this response, like stress affects your body, right? Stress like impacts your body, right?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, like you see it a lot in minority cultures and that, right? Like their body starts being impacted, right? And all those different things. Because we're not letting go of some of this stuff, right? Because we got to be tight. You got to be whatever it is, right? Even if it was like, oh, from a very young age, I was taught to like tighten up, right? Because parents hit me, so I have to like tighten up and get hit, right? So when anything bad comes at me, when something's attacking me, I'm taught to like tighten up, right? And that's like, so when somebody gets upset at me, when somebody feels a certain way, when my boss writes me a very like heavy email, I'm tightening up. Even though you're not noticing, your body's so tight, right? So it's like, okay, let's like relax, let's breathe, right? I don't need the same type of response right now. No one's actually physically attacking me, right? That was an email, right? I disagree with the email, this and that. Made me really upset and all of those things. So helping them verbalize and kind of come out of this state, right? The survival state of like, okay, like no one's actually physically attacking you, right? So if someone's physically attacking you, it's perfectly fine for you like to tighten up and like to get hit, right? Your body's made like when you tighten up to get hit, right? Like, okay, so that's happening.
And talking about the body, how does physical health overall affect the body? Because let's say panic attacks, right? Obviously, if you're overweight and you go through stuff, you'll feel it a lot harder. You could even fall under the hospital. Exercise too. Like, how does it all play a role into your own your mental health as well?
100%, right?
Because even breathing, right, it can affect the way that
100%
mental health.
Yeah, and those things, right? I think a lot of times people think about mental health and your physical body as like a divide, right? There's two different things, but it's all part of this body, right? That we kind of share. Our mind is an organ in our body, so like all of this, right? The brain, right? It's all connected, right? So of course, if you're constantly in this place of like thinking negative thought, right, your body's gonna have a response to that, right? You might be in bed more, right? You might be this and this and that, right? Then your body starts slowly, right, having effects from that, right? Some folks, right, and there's a lot of stuff around like eating disorders and stuff around that, right? That might overeat or undereat, right? Whatever it is, right? Because something is happening for them, right? That they are responding to, right? So folks like, oh, a lot of things were happening at home, and the thing that helped me kind of get through it is like eating, right? Eating is, and like, we all sort of do that, right? Some people just kind of do it more than others, right? It's, people might have a tough day and go get ice cream and help them feel good, right? But if you're doing that every day, right, it takes a toll on your body, right? And that's a fact, right? Physical health, right? It's exercising, all of that. It's huge for your body, right? Again, like the tightness, right? Like being able to kind of run and release some of that, or exercise, whatever you might weight lift, like that's huge, right? It kind of helps your body kind of process and release, right? Instead of just kind of holding it, you're just like holding it, right? You're stretching, you're releasing some of this stuff, right? So I think that's a huge part of it. What therapy does, and this is where I kind of see therapy, right? It starts helping you kind of put language to what's happening, right? Giving you language like, oh, instead of, again, I'm having this example of the email from the boss, right? Or I don't even have a boss. Instead of like having this email from the boss where you're pissed off, but you don't tell anyone, right? You just kind of hold that all day. You get home and you're mad, and then you just kind of like suck it up and kind of hold it in, right? And this experience that you held, instead of like, okay, man, that was kind of like messed up, that email, right? The boss didn't take me into consideration, all these different things that I do, and all this to help you kind of release and process, instead of just like kind of holding it in your head and having this conversation in your head, like, F that guy, this and this and this and this and this and that, right? You're kind of like now able to release it, right? Instead of like having this conversation in your head, right? Or the conversation might be like, I do everything wrong. I always get this wrong, right? And of course, that's gonna impact like your body and the way you do things and the way that you respond to the world around you, right? If I'm constantly thinking sort of like F that guy, this and this and this and this and this and this is what my mind is on today because I got this email, right? Any little thing that like triggers me, I'm gonna have that response now in my body, right? If my child like breaks things in my house, now I'm upset, right? I'm quickly like responding to that, like, hey, what's wrong with you? Why are you breaking that, right? Because I have this energy that was carried over, right? And to be able to know, okay, this is what's happening for me, right? So like what therapy does, it helps you kind of like build language around, right? Again, like a lot of time kids were not taught that to express their emotions, right? So if they get really mad and they're kids, their fists might be balled up, right? Yeah. And a parent should be able to say like, oh, like, see, your fist is balled up. Why is your fist balled up? You're like, oh, because so-and-so made me feel really mad, right? And then you start seeing the kid like slowly like releasing like the hand, right? We still do that to this day.
Yeah,
right?
we do.
Right? So to be able to say like, oh, like, for some reason I'm really like upset, right? And so you're like, oh, like my fist is balled up, or people have different ways that they express their anger, right? Start giving them language, right? And that's why if you do that at a really young age, you have that, right? You have the ability like, oh, okay, like I see it, like I see all this like energy that I'm carrying right now, so I had to find a way to release it, right? So to be able to do that as an adult is like huge.
And going off that, then, so whenever, what does success mean in therapy? Yeah. Because as soon as you start the journey of it, is it a journey of changing habits, or is it more like cybernetics? Because cybernetics is I read this book called the Cybernetics, I think that's what the book is called, and it's just like rewiring the way you think. But do we rewire the way we think first, or do we change our habits first in order to become successful?
That's a really good question, right? I think that definition it depends on the person and also like the therapist, right?
Okay.
Right. So some folks, right, will see a reduction around like symptoms, right? So like came here because I had a lot of panic attacks, right? I was having panic attacks on a daily basis, and now I'm having panic attacks 3 times a week. Then it went down to like 1 time a week, 1 time a month, right? So like there's this physical response where this person like, I also have all this panic attacks, and now it's not like present anymore, right? So there's a huge part of therapy, right? And for a lot of folks, right, like seeing that, it's like, right, like, oh, this has really benefited me, right? I will say, like, of course, that's huge, right? And I think that's, again, even when I have like symptoms, I kind of like, I have this thing, this is really hard to deal with, right? But I think the like, healing that I think I enjoy seeing folks when they start having a voice around some situations, right? That they will start like having this awareness of the situations around them, right? And they're like, okay, before I used to kind of like do everything for people, right? I was sort of this like what they call it, people pleaser, right? So every time somebody needed something, I was there, helped them, this and this and this and this, and I like forgot about myself a lot, right? And this is now they're speaking up for their wants and needs and whatever, advocating for themselves. And they're like, no, that's not gonna happen, this and that, right? And they have this voice that for whatever reason was dormant in them for like forever, and now they're able to speak up, right? Yeah, some of that stuff is all like childhood stuff, right? That for some reason there were thoughts like to repress some of that voice, right? And now they're able to speak up, right? And it's specifically stuff around the trauma stuff, right? So it's anything that's around the trauma now, they're able to speak up, right? When there once was voiceless, right? They didn't have a voice around anytime that somebody got upset with them, right? Because they had this trauma around that. Now they have a voice around it, right? They're like, no, like I'm okay with that. They're able to set boundaries. They're able to do all of these things, right? I think that's like where the healing kind of happens, and that's where like the changes, the rewiring in your brain, right? And that becomes like personality, right? And that over time becomes a personality. Because again, this personality starts to grow in you, right? And over time, it becomes like a part of you. You're like, no, I'm able to speak up, right? I'm not going to just be silent when this happens, right? And it's a balance, right? You're not also going to have this like aggressive response every time, right? Yeah. So that's where I see it, right? And also like huge compassion towards yourself, right? I think that's a huge part of therapy that's probably not talked a bit about, right? So when you're exploring yourself, you're talking about yourself, even when you're talking about your symptoms, right? What you're doing, you're having a conversation about this being, right? And to have that sort of compassion towards yourself, it's huge, right? And I think that's like self-compassion is a huge part of us. I think we all are sort of in this journey for, right? So, but to have this part of us, right? Every time we're anxious, like, fuck, this is happening again, right? And it's like, I'm anxious. I have to be at work. And it's hard, right? There's reasons why we have that, right? But to have a different response now, like, okay, like, I see why you're anxious, right? And that slowly but surely, that part of us, the anxious part, like, okay, like, I don't need to show up. This has but if we counteract it with that same kind of anger, that part's gonna keep showing up as well, right?
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, right? It's the same thing, kind of having a relationship with someone, right? Like, if they are really upset, we're like, what's wrong with you? Why you're upset? They're gonna get upset. So you're gonna have this sort of like this fight happening, right? With person upset, and I'm like calm and relaxed, like, hey man, I'm really sorry about that you felt that way, whatever the situation. That person starts like slowing down and like putting their guards down, right? And it's like, okay, like, I don't need this sort of like response.
We start mimicking that energy,
towards ourselves, right? And that becomes really healing for us, right? And and again, symptom reduction and like removing symptoms, it's huge, right? Like everyone kind of also needs that as well, right?
Yeah.
Like suffering from panic attacks is hard. It's debilitating, right? People miss work, they miss this and that. It's difficult, right? Or whatever the symptom might be, depression or, right? So like it's difficult, right? But to have that response to it, it's huge.
And so being compassionate for yourselves, we're talking about that. And ever since you were younger too, you've heard so many stories, even on your whole journey of through school and now you having your own firm. How do you show compassion to yourself, or how do therapists do it to where they start, okay, like, let me take a step back and let me take care of myself. Because I feel like if you can't take care of yourself first, you can't help nobody in any aspect.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And this is where it's kind of circle back of like every therapist, you need to go through some therapy, right? And get to explore the self. The interesting part about self-compassion, right? They need something to be compassionate about, right? So, and this is where therapy does, right? And people are like, why are we going to talk about sad stuff? Why are we going to talk about this very difficult, painful parts, right?
I'm like that, yeah. I hate it.
And it makes it.
I feel weak.
100%, right? Because it's also like pain and sadness is really close to pain, right? And there's a part of us like, wait, we're trying to survive. Why are you talking about something that, like, because pain and like sadness, all this stuff, they kind of remind us of like dying, right? So there's this part of us like, hey, let me come out of that. Like, I don't want to be messing with that, right?
Yeah.
And the survival part of us, like, we don't want to be down there. Like, that reminds us that we're gonna die and all these different things, right? So a part of us will react to that. Like, everyone will have a reaction to it, right? But what happens, right? If you feel sadness towards something, right? So what happens is, like, let's say we see a child dealing with, I'm using the word homelessness, right? The child dealing with homelessness, right? Part of us is gonna be like, oh, I'm really sad that child kind of goes through that, right? You start seeing that, then you start building empathy towards it, then you start building compassion, right? And then from compassion, then you start doing like the physical stuff, like, oh, I'm gonna help this person out, right? So like there's this process of like, oh, like very sad experience, right? Now you're grieving the sad experience of like, okay, childhood experience was really, really sad, right? Now you build empathy. Now you're building compassion for that younger part of you. And now you're responding, right? There's this compassion, this action part of the compassion that comes after, right? So this is all sort of like in it, right? So therapists, right? They need to kind of have that experience where they are able to see their younger self, right? That they're able to process like their younger self that had all of this experiences during the childhood, right? And like, okay, like I had this experience where my parents ignored me or this and that, right? Parents were really busy or whatever it is, and I felt not seen, not wanted, whatever, right? And start seeing that part, so the sadness, the grief around it, right? And then the compassion part around it, right? And it's a daily reminder, right? We have to kind of remind ourselves that like, hey, like I'm here, I'm present, I'm in this space, right? I have this sort of stuff going for me, right? I benefit a lot from like doing like mindfulness and meditation and some of that stuff, right? It kind of
what is that exactly? Mindfulness.
Yeah, so mindfulness is sort of like being in the present moment, right? So bring yourself to the present moment, slowing everything down, not going too much forward and not too much back, right? Just being here in this space, right? So for me, like just kind of slowing down, breathing, being aware of my breath, right? And be in the present moment, right? So it might be if a lot of things is happening around me, right? Yeah. So like, how can I just be present, right? So like, okay, let me look around this room. I can see this and this and this and this and this. I smell this. So you engage your five senses, right? I'm touching this, right? So that puts me back in this present moment instead of like the email that I received, right? Yeah. Or this anxiety about so-and-so that's coming up, right? So it kind of brings you back to here, right? So engage your five senses in the present moment, kind of brings you back to this space that you're in. Now your mind is more clear and now you're able to engage, right?
The way of the superior man kind of like reminds me of the breathing techniques and being mindfulness. And how big is then meditating? Like, how helpful is it for you?
It's really I have a real. Not everyone has a great response to like mindfulness and meditation, right? Yeah. Some people it's harder for others. For me, like it's really calms my body down, right? It really slows me down. Right, so like breathing and all those exercises, I might even like do it in the shower, right? So I feel the water touching my skin and I will breathe and like it slows me down, right? And I'm a huge advocate around mindfulness because it's not so much the exercise that's coming you down, but what you're doing, this is where the self-compassion comes in. You're having this like dialogue with yourself. Even if you're not saying anything, you're like, oh, like I'm breathing, I'm slowing you down. You're having this sort of like motion towards yourself, right? Like there's this tenderness of like, I'm slowing you down and this and this. So you have this sort of like hidden dialogue of like, I'm worthy enough to like slow down and take care of myself. So you're taking care of yourself. And I think that energy of doing that over and over and over again is huge, right? And so to be able to have some type of practice that you're able to do that over time, it's huge, right? Therapists, they hear a lot. They have these experiences where they, right? So to be able to find a way, okay, like I need to take care of this body, this self, right? So I will run, I will enjoy some things like eating. To me, I enjoy like different type of food, whatever it might be, that kind of takes care of myself, right? To remind myself, I need to take care. I'm taking care of a lot of people. So how do I take care of myself, right? And to be able to do that, right? And not feel selfish about it, right? Some people feel selfish, like no, I need to take care of the world around me, take care of this and this, and I need to help this person, right? Like no, you also deserve to have that time.
Man, and it's packed, because I mean, then the most important thing is then would have compassion for yourself, and having compassion for yourself is maybe also taking that step into taking therapy. We're gonna close out the episode, but before I do, what kind of therapy does your practice do? I think it was like somatic. It's a lot of traditional ones, I think, right?
Yeah, and I think so. Like back to like the where we start, like the integrative part, right? So I do use different like parts of it, right? So I have this framework where I will look at the influence of childhood and how it impacts us now. So that's like sort of the framework that I'm always sort of in my brain kind of like exploring, right? And then there's like practices that we use, right? Somatic practices, right? So a person might come in and they're, again, we talk about being really tight, right? So we're talking about very difficult situations, they kind of become really, really tight, right? And I kind of might notice it, like, hey, when we talk about like you become really tight, let's like, you want to release that, or you want to hold it, what you want to do with that part of your body, right? So they kind of like, oh yeah, I want to release that, right? I'll teach them like breathing exercises, right? To kind of help them kind of release that, right? And that's sort of like the somatic part, right? You can go in even deeper into that, right? Like, oh, like every time we talk about this, what happens to your body? Oh, I feel this energy in my chest. Oh, I feel this in my stomach, right? Whatever it is, and then you kind of explore that, right? So that's the somatic parts, right? There is, again, like I know we talked a little bit, you sent me an email around like EMDR, right? EMDR is very helpful around like specific traumas, right? So I'm training EMDR, right? So EMDR, it's actually not actually built on a lot of like talking, right? And it's really good to like explore traumas, right? And also like reduce symptoms around trauma, right? You have PTSD, you have all the different symptoms, right? Like nightmares or hypervigilance, all these different things, right? So EMDR is really, really a good sort of like practice around like reducing some of those symptoms, right? I've worked with athletes in the past, right, who had this like very difficult injuries, right? And even though their body is back in place, right, every time they kind of will go back on the field or on the court, whatever it is, they're psychologically, their body's like, hey, we don't want to do that move again, because last time we did that, we broke our ankles, or we had this ACL, like all this stuff happens, right? And you're like, oh, okay. And so a lot of parts like reminding their body, right? And EMDR does a really good job, like, no, like it's okay, it's safe, right? You get to kind of go help them kind of do that over and over and over again, right? EMDR uses this what they call eye movement, right? So it's different from traditional therapy, right? It kind of reminds folks of like hypnosis, but you're actually not hypnotized through it.
Okay.
Right. So, but you are moving like your eyes, right? And the therapist, and you're kind of process this experience, right? It's very like traumatic experience, and you're like following it. What that does with what they call like bilateral stimulation, it settles your body, it settles your brain. So you bring up this very emotional experience, right? Like, let's use the example of like a athlete, right? Last time I did that sort of like dribble, I broke my ankle, right? I moved really fast and I twisted my ankle, right? And like help tell them like think about that memory, right? Once they think about that memory, their body starts like having this response, right, in the present moment. So you kind of help ground them. So they're like, okay, and their body starts settling. Then you help to like think about that memory again, right? And they like think about it in their body, and then slowly, like their body starts like okay, like calming. You think about the memory, they're like, okay, I'm not having this response anymore,
okay,
right?
Okay.
So and that's the part of it, like, okay, like my body doesn't need to have that kind of response anymore, and they're able to get back on the court and like do the same moves, right? Again, because our body, there's nothing wrong with it, right? It's just kind of reminding like, hey, be careful.
Yeah.
We did this last time. It really hurt us.
Again, a survival mechanism.
Survival, right? And it's like nothing wrong that it's doing that, right? And that's a huge part of therapy, right? Instead of like fighting against that part, right? It's like, oh, I understand why you're showing up, right? I understand that you're trying to protect me, right? You're trying to protect me from like all of this like pain.
That
right?
complex comes out.
And to be able to say like, okay, like, I don't need you right now. I might need you in the future for different things and different scenarios, but in this situation, I don't need it anymore, right? And to be able to have a relationship with that part, right? Some people even talk to that part, right? People even say like, right? So to get to kind of explore and get to know it, right? So I think that's what EMDR does, right? And where I use a sports analogy, right? But it's can play a role in different traumas for people.
Yep. And to close out that episode, I'd like to ask you a question. I mean, you've seen so much suffrage, so much trauma, so many things that can affect the person. What's the best thing that you would say that we can do to kind of counteract the busy life, the negative thoughts that we have today, just to not think about dying, because you said that that thought of dying brings pain, brings suffrage.
100%. Yeah.
What has helped you personally kind of like counteract?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? And it's a difficult question to answer, right? Yeah. Because not everyone is built different. People are built differently, right? So people have different response to different things. But I think a huge part of like the human experience, right, is like being seen, being noticed, and being validated, right? So if a person is having this experience, to have people around them that they feel seen, noticed, and validated, right? That they're not in their own world, right? Therapy does a great job with that. That there's this consistency of like, I see you every week and I validate your experience, your experience in this world, right? Good, bad, weird, whatever it is. There's this part of this person that shows up and like accepts and validate, right? Very different than agreeing with behavior, right? But accepting the experience of feeling, right? You're connected to a feeling around it, right? And humans need that. Like humans need to be like validated, right? And affirmed, right? And that's only time that a lot of folks are able to like change behaviors also, right? We can't force people to change behaviors. So I think it's a huge part of it, right? And also being able to do that for yourself, right? I think we need it relationally, and we also need to do it for ourselves, right? Like of course that made me feel upset. Of course that made me feel really happy, right? Like I was around that person made me feel good about myself, right? And also validate the positive things, right? Or again, back to the survival part. A part of us will acknowledge all the negative things, right? Just because it's trying to give you warnings, like, hey, be careful, that's happening. This is happening, right? Oh, you feel pain on your lower back, or this and this, right? Even though like the rest of your body might be fine, right? But it's part of like, be careful. There's something that's happening to your back. Be aware of it, right? Again, it's painful and it's taking a lot of attention, but you're like, okay, like my knees feel good. Like that gratitude, right? Like I feel this, right? So affirm these other parts of yourself, right? Validate these other parts of yourself, right? And I think that's a huge thing, being able to do that for yourself and also have folks around you who can do that for you, right?
And thank you for that insight, because that is something that I've noticed myself. Like before, I used to be really in my own world, and I thought me being alone was better than anything else. But I think there's nothing that can compare to just the human experience being validated by other individuals that bring in that exchange of energy that 100%. We require as humans. And again, Sostenes, I do appreciate you coming on the podcast. I feel like we went through a various of topics, but at the end of the day, I feel like there's a lot of either way. I think therapy is so dense that everyone's gonna need different tools to do it. So if you guys are interested in getting therapy, Sostenes, what's your firm called, and where can I find you?
So you my website's called Sunset Trauma Therapy, right? We're based in LA, Los Angeles. I am expanding it to North Carolina, right? So I think there's this part, that's why I'm here in Charlotte.
Yeah.
Right? So I'm expanding it to North Carolina. So I will be able to see clients also in Charlotte and North Carolina area as well. So that's where you guys can find me, just Sunset Trauma Therapy.
And they can contact you from any state, right? Because it's virtual, right?
It's virtual, but I can only see clients where I'm licensed, right?
Okay.
So licensed in California, and I'm working on I'm in the licensure process in North Carolina.
Okay, excellent then. And I do appreciate you coming on the podcast again. And I'll make sure I have the handles, the website, so you guys can contact Sostenes. And I think it was a great episode, and I appreciate your time. So, guys, catch you guys in the next one. Like, comment, subscribe. Tell us what you think about the episode, and I'll make sure to catch you guys in the next one.